In terms of the Berbers, what do we know about the nature of their religious beliefs prior to Islam?
Yeah, so before I answer your question, I just want to address a matter of terminology because we're going to be talking a lot about the Berbers. I mean, one of the big academic debates at the moment is whether the term Berber is appropriate, right? Berber is a historically contingent term. It is not the term that is used for a portion of the native population in North Africa throughout its history, but rather it is a term that seems to arise in the 7th and the 8th centuries. So I will use Berber as a shorthand, but recognizing that there was different terminology used in earlier periods. And very often the terminology we use for the groups we typically call Berber is an outsider terminology. It's not the terms that these communities use for themselves. So before the rise of Islam, I preferred to speak about Moors. Moor is a word that still exists in the English language today, but Moor is also basically a loan word from Latin. So when classical authors were speaking about the autochthonous populations of North Africa, say in late antiquity, the early Islamic period, they spoke about Maori. So the Moorish tribes that existed in North Africa, who came to be labeled as Berbers after the conquest, their religious beliefs varied by the region in question. It is a convenient label for describing a wide swath of people, but this wide swath of people was made up of many subcommunities, and those communities had as much internal variety as there was difference between, say, the Moors and the Romans, or the Moors and the Vandals, or the Byzantines, or whatever outside invader attempted to rule the region. So that's kind of a caveat before I answer your question. So in areas of North Africa where Roman rule was strongest, and by that I mean the Roman province of Africa. The term we have for the entire continent today actually comes from a Latin word and a Latin label to designate what is basically modern day Tunisia. That was the heartland of Roman rule in the classical period and in late antiquity. That was one of the great breadbaskets of the Western Mediterranean, and its capital was Carthage, the famous ancient city. So in places like Tunisia, places like what is today Eastern Algeria, as well as in Western Libya, where the footprint of Roman rule was strongest, and therefore the Roman cultural influence was strongest, we're talking about Moorish populations that were probably Christian. They were in close contact with Roman culture. Christianity from the 4th century onward becomes a central aspect of Roman culture. And so these tribes basically were acculturated to Roman norms, and that included conversion to Christianity. It's hard to say a lot about the form of Christianity that they practiced. I mean, we have huge numbers of texts that tell us about religion in North Africa in late antiquity. I mean, we can think of any number of extremely famous church fathers, such as the great Augustine of Hippo, arguably the greatest, the Latin church fathers who died at the beginning of the 5th century. They have lots to say about religion in Roman North Africa. But by and large, they were focused on communities that were living closer to the coast. They were by and large focused on communities who used Latin as their primary form of communication. And even if they were not, say, ethnically Roman, but rather were the descendants of Moors or the descendant of Punic-speaking populations, they were basically Romanized. So what was happening outside of these communities, we know far, far less. And we basically have to find information on the margins of our texts, accounts of wars and conflict. But that is the big picture that emerges, that in areas where Roman rule was strongest, the Moorish tribes tended to be Christians. In areas beyond the pale of Roman rule, the situation begins to change. Christianity certainly existed outside this core Roman territory, but I think it's safe to say that the further away you get from the Romans, the more these populations are pagan. So we have evidence, say, of Moorish pagan temples in places like Libya that are operating into the 500s. The situation as you go further west into what is today Western Algeria and Morocco is probably even greater preponderance of pagan or polytheistic populations. There are also reports about Jewish populations all mixed in, but that's kind of the big picture. The big distinction seems to be between Christians and pagans, Christians and polytheists, and between people that were living in or near Roman territory and those who were living well outside the margins. And I dwell on this because it's important also for understanding patterns of religious change once we reach the other side of the Islamic Arab conquests in the 7th century, because those patterns also inform the way in which the early Muslims interact with these Moorish tribes, now known as Berbers, and perhaps we'll get to that later.
One thing